Anthropology is a social science that has to do with the study of humanity. It can be used to better understand different groups of people by examining their unique experiences.
For this video, we interviewed 7 different people, half who identify as Asian American or Pacific Islander, and the other half are outsiders who will be sharing their opinions. Throughout the video, you will hear different experiences within the AAPI groups inside and outside of school.
So how would you describe your ethnicity?
I would describe my ethnicity as Asian American.
Do you have a specific like nationality, like Vietnamese,
Yeah,
Chinese?
Vietnamese, yeah.
So how would you describe your ethnicity?
White. I mean, predominantly, but I mean, I'm also, my mom's Ashkenazi Jewish, which is an ethnicity, so I'm Ashkenazi Jewish, 50%, and then everything else is just broadly Western European, so white.
All right, so how would you describe your ethnicity?
I would be Guatemalan and American.
How would you describe your ethnicity?
I don't give it any thought, to be honest with you. I can't recall being ever being asked that.
Okay. And have you ever like struggled with your cultural identity?
Not really, no. I kind of like, just like, again, like you said, I don't really think about it in my day-to-day life. It's just kind of who I am, and I don't really struggle with that much.
I think sometimes I've had to like limit my culture or overshare it. I think it depends. In some circumstances, I don't really talk about like who I am, being in America, but in other times it's like encouraged. So I think that really depends.
How has like growing up in the United States impacted like your cultural identity?
I definitely get to see and kind of experience a multitude of sides. I mean, like, like American culture is definitely different than, Vietnamese culture, for example.
Would you say there are ever tensions between like your Vietnamese side and the American side, like any cultural differences that don't really mix well?
I mean, definitely. I mean, just like stepping into like my household or versus like going outside of my household alone is like different. You know what I mean? Just like, like how other households may be like in American culture is like a certain way and kind of certain lifestyle versus, like Vietnamese Americans, like within the household is much more different.
Could you explain an aspect of your culture that goes against American culture?
Well, this doesn't really go against American culture, but especially like in China and in Hong Kong, the parents will be a lot more like pressing on their kids about like going to good schools and like getting good grades, and like basically in America I feel like it's sometimes like the opposite, where like parents will want their kids to like go out and hang out, but like in China and Hong Kong, like people want like their kids to like get good grades and to like spend their time like studying and to get into good colleges, and there's a lot more pressure.
I think maybe like the way that some people in like the Filipino culture treat each other. I know they're very strict with like, because a lot of Filipino people are Catholic, and even though a lot of people here in America are Catholic, I think the way that a lot of parents might treat their kids can go against what a lot of American parents say, with like the strictness and the harshness, and I think those two kind of clash.
With American traditions that, like it's a lot more than that, versus just, kind of getting the money and getting the nice house and getting the nice cars and this and that. It's much more, like do what you want to do what makes you happy. There's a lot of that American aspects in that, which you may not see in very traditional Asian American cultures.
But like what issues faced by Asian Americans have you noticed maybe in like recent years?
At San Marin and just throughout Nevada, you'll hear all like the stereotype jokes and the accents and all the casually racist remarks that happen.
People think of them as like smart. They have high expectations for Asians, especially when they come here, and I feel like that's just an unhealthy way of like welcoming them if they ever do come here. Like, not all of them have that academic knowledge, not all of them have that like knowledge of like everything, and they expect a lot from them, especially when, like how Brandon said it, a lot for college, a lot with work, and a lot with like outside of like school and stuff like that.
People denote like the difference between positive and negative stereotypes. Personally, I don't think there is a difference. I think any stereotyping can be bad.
What do you see as wrong with the model minority?
Because it sets up this perception that this group of people is supposed to, be like have high income, have like all these positive attributes, and when they don't, they're immediately seen as less than the rest of their peers.
There is sort of the legacy of the myth of the model minority, in that there still is, I think, a prevailing general belief in many of the institutes that Asians really don't have that many problems. There is the other issue that Asians don't have that many problems. And despite evidence of the immigrant paradox, which is that the health and mental health of immigrants, once they get to the United States, actually becomes worse. Asian Americans have such a low prevalence of this disorder, such that there seems to be no need for research on this population. It actually said it in the RFA, you know, and clearly at that time there was evidence that Asian Americans had lower rates of that disorder, but that doesn't mean it's not important to study for that population.
I think generally white culture lumps Asian into everything.
It's really common for people to not know the difference between how the languages sound even, which is pretty shocking because they all sound pretty different. So even in those big three, people still get confused or are inarticulate about it. And yeah, it's definitely common to see people just kind of forget that other Asian nations exist.
In Asian American culture, it's very typically inside the box. It's very, straightforward. This is what you need to do. This is what's best for you. Versus here, it's much more it's different. It's much more, create your own path. It's more do what makes you happy. No matter what it may be.
So I think what's interesting is all of these Asian Americans that we interviewed here at San Marin, they all obviously grew up here, and so you'd think that they'd have a lot of American influence. And I think what Brandon was talking about is how we felt equally Vietnamese and equally American. And I thought that was interesting because you'd think you'd be more one or the other. All of the students we interviewed mentioned stereotypes in one form or another. And what I thought was really interesting about stereotypes pertaining to Asian Americans is something that Jack brought up, and that's that this idea that there's positive stereotypes and negative stereotypes. Yeah. And we often associate Asians in America with having the positive stereotype of being very academic, very well off. But I think what Jack mentioned, and I thought this was very interesting, was that even that positive stereotype is negative since it sets up this false expectation for Asians, and it creates this idea that Asians have to be a certain way. I believe Caleb was talking about in the sense of there's a big difference between the Asian American culture and broader, I guess, white American culture, in that on average, or generally speaking, white parents tend to be more, they tend to be less strict with their children, their kids. I feel like with white parenting, it's more well, you let your kids grow on their own, and then they follow their own path, I guess you could say. Yeah. Whereas as what Caleb was mentioning in Asian culture, and even Brandon was mentioning this too, it's sort of this idea that the parents lay the guidelines and the kids follow them. So there's not a lot of room for, I guess, developing your own individual personality, or not personality, sorry, but your own individual character, setting your own path, which I think that shows a really big divide between American culture and Asian culture.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like when it comes to American culture, yeah, like you said, they can do whatever they want, kind of, or they have their own sort of path. Obviously, that's not for everyone, but for me, I wasn't able to go out that much. I'd ask a lot, and I still wouldn't be able to go out. Now I've just accepted if I can't go out, I can't go out.
Yeah, and I think this shows sort of how power plays into this, how this group, how Asian Americans relate to power, in the sense of the parents have a lot of power over the kids. Yeah. And I feel in America it's almost the opposite. We were talking about this in class earlier, where it's almost in America, kids boss around the parents. The kids decide what the parents do, and the parents sort of just provide for the kids. So I think that was interesting.
Yeah.
Some of the people that we interviewed talked about how we group together minority groups as just one. So for example, we group all Asians as one, all Hispanics as one. What's your experience with that?
I feel for sure, I've been called that I look like Guatemalan. I don't know. Well, I mean, I don't really mind personally, but there's other people that do get bothered. Because Mexican, Guatemalan, Salvadorian, sometimes they're just all kind of grouped up together. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting thing that Americans, specifically white Americans, tend to view all these different, ethnicities as sort of one big group, even though there's obviously differences.
Yeah.